So I'll just crack on with this. The first thing I would say though, I don't know which paper you buy, but I bought the Scotsman yesterday and I thought this was just a brilliant headline. You know, the one stretch of wild water that could power half of Scotland's homes. That is the Finland Firth. Fantastic. It even mentioned on the front page. It's just fantastic news for Orkney. I mean, if this comes off, and the Scottish Parliament is backing that, if this comes off, this could be very significant for us and for our economy. And Caithness, to be honest, because they're gearing up to work from the other side across the water. So it's just great news all round. So, as I say, the future of the country is in, and these islands, I would say, is in your hands. On the 18th of September, we'll all be asked, should Scotland be an independent country? And the answer is either yes or no. But just for a minute, using a scale of 1 to 10, and not necessarily asking you to say where you are, but bear in mind that a scale like this, 1 means you would be definitely voting no, and 10 would be definitely voting yes. If you could just think, just for a second or two, about where you think you would be currently on that scale. And if you are having a conversation with anyone, and you were interested to discuss this with them, I would say that was a starting point of trying to find out where people are in their thinking, and not necessarily assuming one thing or another. I've actually found that quite helpful with my own family. These are the key things I find in talking to people. Will we survive as an independent country? Can we afford that? What has been achieved so far? Has the Scottish Parliament been worth it? You know, what will be the effect on Orkney? And also, people are saying, why wasn't Devo Max an option? So if we cover those points, are we too small to be an independent country? Well, not according to these people. David Cameron and Alistair Darling have both said Scotland would be a viable independent country. Not a question in their own mind, and neither are our own politicians thinking that. And indeed, Nigel Lawson, who was Margaret Thatcher's Chancellor, said that Scotland's perfectly capable of being an independent nation, and there are many independent countries in the world who have a lot less going for them than Scotland. Now, from Margaret Thatcher's Chancellor, that was quite a significant statement, I felt. That's Nigella Lawson's father. In case you don't know, I didn't know, my girls told me that. So there we are. But perfectly capable of being an independent nation. So I would put to you that currently there are 190, hello, come on in. Currently there are 193 independent nations who form the United Nations. Most of them have become independent since the Second World War, and 90 of them are smaller or the same size as Scotland. And here are some examples. These are countries on the left who are roughly the same size as us, 5 million plus population. And I was actually quite surprised when I was investigating that, because I didn't think countries like Libya would be there. You just see it as a vast African country, but its population is no bigger than ours. And then on the right we've got some others. And the most recent country to join the EU is actually Croatia. But you can see there's a huge number of countries. Bear in mind this is 90 in total. And bear in mind too that 3 of them, these independent countries, the top 3, are either the same size or smaller than Orkney. And then the 3 at the bottom are no bigger than Orkney and Shetland combined. And all of these countries have their own voice in the United Nations, any economic bloc in their area, where it's applicable, they're in the Commonwealth, where it's applicable, they're in NATO, etc. For me, so there's no question that small countries can survive, and here are just some examples of more familiar countries that you might be familiar with. So Europe, and I've tried to pick countries that are on roughly different continents. But I mean, if you look, Luxembourg's no bigger than Edinburgh, and Iceland's almost about the same size as Aberdeen. So, what to bear in mind is that currently Scotland generates 9.9% of all the UK taxes, but we only account for 9.3% of the spending. So the difference it amounts to, if we were in an independent country, there would be an extra £4.4 billion available for Scotland to use. We've got up to 24 billion barrels of oil remaining in the North Sea, and at today's prices that would be £1.5 trillion. And that was before they announced Kraken was going to be developed, the field just off Shetland. But it was interesting too that on the 11th of November last year, Sir Ian Wood, who's a prominent businessman in the north-east of Scotland, he actually says there is every chance he could put these estimates will be too low, and that we're using new technology we could pull out more oil. And that report came out the day after Chick Brodie, who was a member of the Scottish Parliament, revealed that there was a massive cover-up. You may have seen just before Christmas that a whole load of government papers had come out under the 30-year rule, and Chick went in and had a look at this, and what he found was that there was two major oil companies were wanting to explore off the west coast of Scotland, and the Ministry of Defence blocked it because they use it for bombing and they use it for firing guns in there. So it was all stopped, but there's every chance that there is something out there, but we can't say for sure that that's the case. But take away oil, you would see that food and drink, it's an all-time high. Scotland is exporting £5.4 billion. And we've got other leading industries that you can see there: engineering, life sciences, creative industries, life assurance, wealth management, etc. For the second paragraph, we could produce 25% of Europe's potential offshore wind and tidal energy and 10% of Europe's need for wave power. We're in a very strong financial position if you look at all of these facts brought together. Added to that, the Scottish Parliament. And I would invite you to remember that when I'm speaking, I speak about the Scottish Parliament, not the Scottish Government. Now, the reason for that is that most of the measures that have been passed and most of the motions that have been passed by the Scottish Parliament, the majority of our MSPs voting. And the majority of our MSP are voting for a non-nuclear Scotland. And that would take the trident out of the holy loch. And currently, we have to contribute £163 million a year to the trident. And that would pay for what you see there: teachers, nurses, primary schools, or other things if we chose other priorities. But the more important thing is down the bottom. The Scottish Parliament doesn't want to replace Trident, considers it just a complete and utter waste of money. It's not good value for money. But if they do replace it, the Westminster do vote to replace it, it's going to cost Scotland a further £250 million. So these things are costing us a heck of a lot of money that could otherwise be used for what we would think would be better purposes in Scotland. Everything we produce in goods and services, the gross domestic product of Scotland, stands at £28,500, and that compares with the UK average at just over 24. So even without Scotland's oil, we would still be a GDP which was 99% of the UK average. So if you take the oil out of that, it's perfectly viable that Scotland can manage economically. How we would distribute that money is always the question, of course. And that would have to be voted through our own Parliament. But people living in Scotland are paying £10,700 per head in taxes, compared with the UK average of £9,000. So we're generating more wealth here and paying more tax. Our public spending is a lower percentage in the UK, and our deficit is 5%. So that's lower than UK average as well. So our debts are not as high, and our income is higher. Now, recently you would see that the UK Treasury is guaranteeing that when Scotland votes yes, they will guarantee the UK debt. So in the 2 years between 2014 and 2016, there will be negotiations taking place about all sorts of things. But one of them will be the debt, and we're being invited to fear the idea that we won't be able to cope with our debt. The Treasury are saying, we'll help you work that one out. So can we afford independence? Well, the truth is that if we were an independent country today, we would be the 8th wealthiest country in the OECD. That's the Overseas, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. And that compares with the UK's position at the moment of 16th in the well in the OECD. The pound. Last January, Alistair Darling spoke on Newsnight Scotland and said quite categorically that Scotland using the pound was logical and desirable. Now, whatever's happened, I have no idea, I don't know who he's spoken to, and I know that he's saying otherwise now, but that's what he said last January. What is important for us all to remember is that the pound being used by 4 different countries is actually only one of 17 currency unions in the world. There are many countries that share their currency with other bigger nations. And this is not unusual for us to be considering using the pound. Indeed, Ireland used the pound for quite a lot of years after it was independent. But the other thing about this is that Scottish Parliament agrees that if we use the pound, then business in Scotland, because bear in mind, England is one of our biggest markets, but if we use the pound, we will save everybody £500 million in transaction taxes. If we have to use a different currency and there has to be conversion happening the whole time, that's what's called the transaction tax. And so if we're all using the pound, these taxes, translation costs just disappear. Orkney's future? Well, everything I've mentioned earlier on, we've got a big food and drink industry. Our engineering and science is growing, but we've always had some oil, gas, other engineering, tourism, creative industries. We've got a very good mixed economy here, and we want to preserve that. Also, we've got excellent public services. And bear in mind that public services draw money into Orkney. The better we are at whatever we do, the more money we get to provide even better services. And so Orkney's future is bright. There's no question about that in an independent Scotland. But there is a dark side to this. I don't know if everybody's aware of that, but probably the big discussion tonight with the NFU will be that Orkney farming and Scottish farming generally is losing out big time. The Westminster government announced on the 8th of November last year that it would not pass on €230 million to Scottish farming that Scottish farming is entitled to. The EU had specified that money to come to Scotland because of the particular conditions under which our farmers need to work and the particular difficulties they face. So the whole lot of that 230 million should have been coming to Scotland, and Orkney should have been getting its share. So we're going to lose out on 60 million a year until 2020, because we're only getting 16.4% of that money coming this side of the border. So if we were an independent country, first of all, we'd have been in at the negotiations, and we would have been able to put our own case for getting a particular rate per hectare, or whatever we wanted to consider, Pillar 1, Pillar 2 and so on. We would have been able to make our own case, as Latvia, Estonia, etc., all these very small countries have been able to do. We would have been able to make our own case, and the whole lot of that money, and possibly more than that, would have been coming to Scotland. We are concerned that Orkney's inshore fishing grounds are being damaged. Our understanding is that dredgers are coming up, because they've been chased out of other places around the UK, and they're busy dredging our seabed, and that will cause a problem because the bulk of our fishing now is inshore. We're looking for lobsters, crabs and a variety of other species, and a lot of that product is being used in places like Orkney Fishermen's Society and then exported away, some of it live product and some of it processed product. But nonetheless, if that dredging continues and our fishing grounds are damaged, they could be damaged for all time maybe, but certainly for a long time. And we need to try and sort this out. The only way we can sort that out is by having a voice in the European Union that says this is not acceptable and we're not going to put up with it anymore. But the most important thing about all of these things is that in 2017 the UK will vote on whether to stay in or get out of Europe. So if we vote no, we'll be in Westminster. The Westminster government will then have an in-out referendum on Europe in 2017. Orkney and Orkney's businesses and Scotland's businesses will be severely damaged if we come out of Europe. Now, there are upsides and downsides of Europe, and I know there are various things that I personally would like to see changed in Europe, but I wouldn't want to get out of Europe. I don't know how you feel about that, but I think that is a big threat, and that threat clearly exists because of the threat to the Tories by UKIP, but UKIP are not a threat in Scotland. We don't have to make that severe decision. But remember, some of the money we get from the European Union is not just about fishing and farming and what have you. It's about sustaining a rural economy. They don't want an industrialisation happening in Europe whereby the land isn't being looked after, the land isn't kept. We don't have viable communities in the countryside. They want all that to happen. And they're using the vehicle of giving monies to fishing, farming, etc. to maintain a viable rural community. And of course, one of the problems with all of that is that you've got companies like the Royal Mail are now being taken out of public ownership and being privatised. The Scottish Parliament has said that if we vote yes and we are independent, that decision will be reversed. So Westminster isn't working for Scotland. For 34 years out of the last 68, since 1945, Scotland's been run by a government in Westminster that it hasn't voted for. We've voted one way, the rest of the UK have voted another, and we just get swamped. There's 600 plus MPs, and we've only got just under 60. And a good thing here is that the Westminster's bringing in tax and welfare reforms, and, well, it's the coalition government. The Lib Dems have to take their share of blame in this respect, I'm sure. But the thing is that although the Scottish Parliament doesn't agree with these tax and welfare reforms, we can't do anything at all about their introduction. And also, it's going to be hard to resist the privatisation of the health service. Because although the Scottish Parliament consensus, and bear in mind this is all the parties in Scotland, feel that what we want is an NHS which is free at the point of need to everybody. There was legislation brought into England, which is a health and social care bill, that is passed by the coalition government in Westminster, and it insists that up to 40, maybe even 49% of beds in the NHS will have to be made available for private health care. And all that's going to do is mean that the people who can't afford private health care are going to be very much squeezed. There are going to be longer waiting lists and so on and so forth. And if you ever get the chance to speak to Alistair Carmichael, which I'm hoping to in the next month or two, my question to him will be, as the Lib Dems chief whip, why did you insist that all of your people went through the corridors to vote for that? He was one of the chief whips who pushed that through the Westminster Parliament. As a result of all that, we've got tax cuts for the wealthy, and we've got people who are reliant on food banks now, and that's even in Orkney. We've got a food bank in what was the Dewson's building on the back road, people who cannot afford food. And the recent research shows that if you look at the gap between the wealthiest in our society and the poorest in our society, the UK is now the fourth most unequal country amongst the advanced economies. The Scottish Parliament is the other thing. It only makes decisions on 7% of the budget that's raised in Scotland. And if you get the Scotland Act, which is what the coalition are trumpeting, and the No campaign are trumpets, saying you're going to get more powers. Yeah, we're going to get more powers, I don't dispute that, but it's still only going to be 18% of the decisions that are made in Scotland. 82% of the decisions that affect us and the way our country runs are still going to be made in London and by the Westminster government, because these are the key things that we won't have control over. This is not coming to us. There are elements of it coming to us, but on the whole, this is not coming to us. But as an independent country, we would be in charge of all this stuff on the previous slide, but we would also be in charge of that. Well, what's the Scottish Parliament done for you? You know, it sounds a bit like Monty Python, but just bear in mind, we have no tuition fees, we have no prescription charges, the council tax has been frozen, we have free personal care, bus passes for citizens over 60, land reform was passed through which allowed people on gear and egg to buy the land from absentee landowners and then start to develop the land, create jobs and wealth for themselves. And we have an anti-nuclear policy. Now, when these things were being introduced, there were many people that said these are unaffordable, and yet for the last 6 years, these things have been in place, and the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament, has balanced its budget on every single year. So they are affordable, it's a question of priorities. Westminster, I don't know if you know it, but Westminster could shut down the Scottish Parliament tomorrow if a motion was passed in Westminster to do that. And it is worth noting that Westminster is currently taking powers away from the Welsh Assembly. And okay, they're legal powers, and yes, Wales shares its legal system with England, and there'll be a justification for what they're doing. I don't know what it is in full. I don't understand it fully. I've read it, but I don't fully understand it. But initially they gave those powers to the Welsh Assembly, and they've decided they're not having them anymore and they'll take them back. When Alistair Darling was here in Orkney, he said power should not be in London or Edinburgh. It should be about how we can decentralise more, i.e. a federal country with proper powers being given to everybody. But if that's true, and more power should have been given, why were we or not all given a vote on more powers? Why did they vote down the idea of having evil max, a middle ground between yes and no? Why did they vote against that being on the ballot paper? You're not getting that choice. I'm not getting that choice. And the other thing about it, I've always put forward, and I put this forward particularly to our Lib Dem colleagues who have been big federalists and big home rulers for a long time, but the current Lib Dem, I'm saying to them, why are we not getting a proper federal system? You know, I agree that the northeast of England, northwest of England, southwest of England are maybe in need of more powers. But you can only do that if you create a proper federal system. And they need to be thinking about that. Referendum, if some of you remember that, they said vote no and we'll give you something better. And then it was 20 years before they established the Scottish Parliament. It was basically forgotten about for 20 years. What we finished with is saying, please bear in mind that when you're speaking to people, you might actually find that enough of them are saying, we didn't want to vote for yes because of Alexander. We know he's like Marmite. You love him or hate him. Some people think he's one of the best politicians around. He's won various international awards for that. There's other people who just can't stand him. But the yes, voting yes, is not about voting for the current Scottish Government. It's not about voting for the SNP, and it's not about voting for Alexander. Because we will vote in September, and when we vote yes, it will then be 2 more years between that and the first vote for a fully independent Scottish Government. And by then there will have been a political realignment in Scotland. Other parties may come, parties may go, new parties may be established, we may end up with more independent MPs, and so on and so forth. We don't know, but the new Scottish Government in 2016 will be very different from the Scottish Parliament that we have today. The last thing about the debate, and that was everybody's saying that Alex Salmond should be debating on television with David Cameron. And David Cameron is saying he's not the right person to make the case for the continued Westminster government in Scotland. If that's the case, is he the right person to govern Scotland just now? Now, the other slides are just about contacting us if you want. If you've got continuing questions, if you would like, you can sign the declaration. I've got a slide there that gives you the way to get there. If you're undecided, you can actually use that leaflet, or you can use that website and fire your question into Yes Scotland to have answer. And if you'd like to speak to us further after tonight, or you'd like us to come and meet with family, we're very keen actually to do like coffee mornings and things like that. So if you wanted to invite 4 or 5 folk into your house and have a cup of coffee, or meet us in the town, or whatever the case might be on a smaller basis, maybe a few people around the table, then feel free to contact us. But there's our email address, and Yes Orkney's on Facebook as well if you use Facebook.